But then something unexpected happened. The human fighters suddenly broke formation and scattered in every direction. Princess Callan frowned. At first, she assumed they were retreating. Humans often panicked when faced with overwhelming force. Her tactical officers seemed to think the same. Enemy formation collapsing, one officer reported. Good, Callan said coldly. Pursue and destroy them. The Valoran fighters accelerated. That was exactly what Captain Jake Morrison had hoped for. On the human flagship, warning lights flashed across the bridge. Lieutenant Amy Burke watched the tactical display. They took the bait, she said. Jake nodded. Phase 1. His voice remained calm. Across the asteroid field, hundreds of small objects hidden among the rocks suddenly activated. To Valoran sensors, they had appeared to be nothing more than debris. Now they came alive. Missile pods. Railgun platforms. Drone swarms. Dozens. Then hundreds. The asteroid field exploded into motion. Princess Callan's eyes widened. What is that? No one answered immediately. Because no one understood what they were seeing. Human weapons erupted from every direction. Valoran fighters pursuing the scattered humans suddenly found themselves trapped inside a deadly crossfire. Missiles streaked from hidden launchers. Railgun rounds tore through shields. Attack drones slammed into engines and weapon systems. Within seconds, 7 Valoran fighters vanished in bright explosions. Then 12 more. Then 20. Impossible. Commander Thros stared at the casualty reports. Our sensors never detected those installations. Callan's jaw tightened. The humans had hidden an entire defense network inside the asteroid field, not powerful enough to win a direct battle, but powerful enough to turn every kilometer of space into a death trap. On the human bridge, Amy allowed herself a small smile. They're responding exactly as predicted. Jake studied the battlefield. Valoran commanders were doing what they always did. Following doctrine. Following procedure. Following rules. Humans preferred something different. Creativity. Improvisation. Chaos. The things military academies struggled to teach. Phase 2. Jake gave the order. A second surprise appeared. Several large asteroids suddenly changed course. Valoran sensors immediately identified the problem. Engines. The rocks had engines. For 3 months, human engineers had secretly hollowed out asteroids and converted them into massive kinetic weapons. Now they accelerated directly toward the Valoran formation. Alarm sirens screamed across Callan's flagship. Collision warnings. Multiple objects inbound. Impact in 6 minutes. Callan stood from her command throne. For the first time in years, she felt uncertainty. Not fear. Not yet. But uncertainty. Humans weren't fighting the way they were supposed to fight. They weren't following accepted military doctrine. They weren't behaving like a weaker civilization. They were behaving like predators. Destroy the asteroids, she ordered. Hundreds of plasma batteries opened fire. Several rocks shattered apart. But not all of them. Some survived. And hidden inside those asteroids were thousands of smaller drones. When the rocks exploded, the drones poured out like angry insects. The battlefield became chaos. Everywhere Callan looked, human traps activated. Every assumption she had made was proving wrong. Every prediction she trusted was failing. The primitive colony she expected to conquer in an hour was fighting like an enemy that had prepared for years. Commander Thros looked at the casualty reports. His face had gone pale. Princess. Callan turned. We've already lost 28 fighters. Silence filled the bridge. 28. In less than 20 minutes. Against humans. Against a colony force. That should have been impossible. Far below, on the surface of Epsilon 7, civilians watched the battle through shelter monitors. Families. Children. Farmers. Miners. People who had no desire for war. People simply trying to survive. Captain Jake Morrison wasn't fighting for territory. He wasn't fighting for glory. He was fighting for them. And that made him dangerous. Because there is nothing more dangerous than a person defending their home. Kaylin stared at the tactical display. For the first time since arriving in the system, she stopped seeing insects. She stopped seeing primitives. She stopped seeing weak little humans. Instead, she saw an enemy. A real enemy. One capable of thinking, planning, adapting. And suddenly she understood something that should have been obvious from the beginning. The battle was not going according to plan. And if she made one more mistake, the first defeat of Princess Kaylin's career might begin right here over Epsilon 7. Then she realized they were moving with purpose towards specific coordinates in the asteroid field. Her tactical officer reported strange energy readings from multiple locations among the rocks. Before Kaylin could order her ships to investigate, the asteroids themselves seemed to come alive. Hidden weapons platforms emerged from camouflaged positions and opened fire on her fleet. The humans had turned the entire asteroid field into a trap. Her ships were caught between defensive fire from the colony and surprise attacks from positions she had not known existed. 3 of her light cruisers took heavy damage before they could adjust their formations. Her fighter screen was forced to split up to deal with threats from multiple directions. Kaylin felt anger rising in her chest, but also something else she had not expected. She felt impressed. This level of tactical planning was not something she thought humans were capable of. She demanded to know who had designed these defenses. Commander Thros checked the intelligence reports and confirmed it was Captain Jake Morrison. The human commander had personally overseen every aspect of the defensive preparations. He had used the 3 months of warnings to turn a weak position into a layered death trap. Kaylin studied the battle patterns more carefully. Morrison was not just defending randomly. He was channeling her forces into specific areas where his weapons had maximum advantage. He was using the terrain and his inferior numbers to create situations where Valeran technological superiority meant less. It was actually quite brilliant for a human. The battle continued for another hour, and the human resistance remained strong. Kaylin's forces had superior weapons and shields, but Morrison kept finding ways to exploit tactical situations. His fighters would swarm a single ship from multiple angles, forcing it to break formation. Then his heavier vessels would concentrate fire on the isolated target. He was picking apart her fleet piece by piece. 2 of her heavy cruisers were crippled in venting atmosphere. 1 of her destroyers had been destroyed completely. These were losses she had not anticipated. These were losses that would require explanation when she returned home. Her anger at the humans grew, but so did her curiosity about their commander. What kind of man could turn certain defeat into a competitive battle? What kind of tactical mind could outthink Valoran military doctrine that had been perfected over centuries? She made a decision that surprised her own crew. She ordered communications to open a direct channel to Captain Morrison. She wanted to see this human who dared to challenge her. She wanted to look into his eyes and understand what made him fight so hard for a worthless colony world. The communications officer looked uncertain but obeyed. After a moment, the main view screen flickered and showed the interior of a human ship bridge. Then a man appeared on screen, and Kaylin saw Captain Jake Morrison for the first time. He was younger than she expected, maybe in his mid-30s by human standards. He had dark hair that looked slightly messy, and eyes that showed exhaustion. His uniform was plain and functional, without the decorations that Valoran officers wore. But when he looked at the camera, his gaze was steady and strong. He did not look afraid, even though he was facing the most powerful warrior princess in the Valeran Empire. Morrison spoke first, and his voice was calm. He said he was honored to meet Princess Kaylin, though he wished it was under better circumstances. His tone was respectful but not submissive. Kaylin found herself studying his face, looking for signs of weakness or deception. She told him that his tactics were impressive for a human. She had not expected such competent resistance, but impressive tactics would not save his colony. He should withdraw now, and she would allow his forces to leave with honor. She offered this because she respected his skill as a warrior. It was more consideration than she would give most humans. Morrison smiled, but it was not a happy expression. He thanked her for the offer, but declined. He said the people on Epsilon 7 were counting on him and his crew. They had come here to build new lives, and they deserved protection. He would not abandon them, no matter what the cost. Kaylin felt something strange in her chest. It might have been respect, or it might have been frustration. She told Morrison that his loyalty was admirable, but pointless. She had ships and weapons he could not match. His people would die if he continued this fight. Morrison's expression became more serious. He agreed that his people might die here, but he promised that the Valerans would pay for every meter of ground. His forces would make this the most costly victory Kaelin had ever won. He would make sure she remembered Epsilon 7 for the rest of her life. Then he cut the communication channel before she could respond. Kaelin sat back in her throne and stared at the empty screen. No one had ever spoken to her that way. No one had ever challenged her so directly. She should have been furious, but instead, she found herself thinking about Morrison's words and the determination in his eyes. Commander Thross asked what order she wanted to give. Should they press the attack and destroy the human forces? Kaelin looked at the battle display showing the current positions of both fleets. Her forces still had the advantage, but casualties were mounting higher than projected. Morrison had proven he meant his promise. Every victory would cost lives and resources. She made a calculated decision. She ordered her fleet to pull back to a higher orbit and regroup. They would analyze the human tactics and prepare a new attack plan. This battle was not over, but it would not be won through simple force. She needed to match Morrison's tactical creativity with her own. Thross looked surprised, but transmitted the orders. The Valoran ships began withdrawing to safer positions. On the human side, the defenders did not pursue. They held their positions and prepared for the next assault. Kaelin spent the rest of the day reviewing battle recordings. She watched Morrison's fighters execute complex maneuvers that should have been beyond human capability. She studied how he coordinated his forces to maximize damage while minimizing exposure. The more she watched, the more she understood that she had underestimated this enemy. Captain Jake Morrison was not a primitive human stumbling through battle. He was a skilled commander who understood warfare at a fundamental level. He thought several moves ahead like a chess master. He adapted to changing situations instantly. He inspired his crews to fight beyond their normal limits. These were qualities that Kaelin valued in Valoran warriors. Finding them in a human was disturbing and fascinating at the same time. She found herself wanting to talk to Morrison again. She wanted to understand how he had developed such skills. She wanted to know what experiences had forged him into the warrior he clearly was. But those thoughts were dangerous for a Valoran princess. She was supposed to destroy humans, not admire them. Her duty was clear. Her orders were explicit. She would take this colony by force and prove that humanity could not stand against the Empire. Yet, as she prepared her battle plans for the next day, she could not stop thinking about Morrison's eyes. They had shown courage and determination, but also something else. They had shown pain and loss. Whatever drove this human to fight so hard came from somewhere deep. He was not fighting for glory or conquest. He was fighting to protect something he believed in. Kaelin understood that motivation, even if she did not want to admit it. She had fought many battles for duty and honor. But the battles that mattered most were the ones fought for something worth protecting. Perhaps she and Captain Morrison were not so different after all. The thought troubled her as she finally went to sleep that night. 3 days passed with small skirmishes between the Valoran and human forces, but no major battles. Both sides were testing each other and looking for weaknesses. Kaelin was preparing for a massive assault that would overwhelm Morrison's defenses through sheer numbers. She had called for reinforcements from nearby Valoran systems. In 2 more days, her fleet would be large enough to crush any resistance. Morrison had to know this, but he continued to hold his position. Kaelin respected his courage, even as she planned his defeat. She spent her time studying every detail of his tactics, looking for patterns she could exploit. She barely slept and hardly ate. Her officers were worried about her, but she ignored their concerns. Defeating this human had become more than just a mission. It had become a challenge she needed to win. On the 4th morning, everything changed in a way no one expected. The sensor arrays on both fleets suddenly screamed warnings. A massive energy signature appeared at the edge of the system. Both Valoran and human forces stopped shooting at each other and turned their attention to the new arrival. A ship emerged from the darkness between stars, and it was like nothing either side had ever seen. It was enormous and shaped wrong. Parts of it looked like living tissue, while other parts were clearly mechanical. Dark energy pulsed through channels on its surface. The ship moved toward both fleets with clear, hostile intent. Kaelin felt her blood turn cold as recognition hit her. She had seen drawings of ships like this in ancient Valeran historical archives. The Devourers. They were supposed to be extinct. Her ancestors had fought a terrible war against them 500 years ago, and supposedly destroyed every last one. But here was a Devourer warship very much alive. and heading straight toward them. Commander Thros was reading the sensor data with growing horror. He reported that the ship was charging weapons that could destroy entire planets. It would be in firing range of both fleets in less than 20 minutes. Their combined forces might be enough to stop it, but only if they worked together. Alone, neither the Valorans nor the humans had enough firepower to damage that monster. Kaylin made a decision faster than she had ever decided anything in her life. She ordered communications to open a channel to Captain Morrison on all frequencies. She did not have time for pride or protocol. Every second counted. Morrison's face appeared on her screen within moments. He looked grim, and she could see his own sensor displays showing the Devourer ship behind him. Before he could speak, Kaylin started talking. She explained what the ship was and what it could do. Devourers consumed all biological life they encountered. They turned living beings into fuel for their ships. Neither humans nor Valerans would survive if that thing reached them. Kaylin took a breath and said something she never thought she would say to a human. She asked for help. She told Morrison that neither of their forces could stop the Devourer alone, but together, they might have a chance. She asked him to transmit his tactical frequencies and weapon specifications. Her people would coordinate with his to create attack patterns that used both their strengths. It was the only way they would survive the next few hours. Callan expected Morrison to make demands or ask for concessions. She expected him to use this moment of weakness to gain advantage. Instead, Morrison simply nodded and agreed immediately. He said his science officer, Lieutenant Amy Burke, would coordinate with Kaylin's tactical team. They had about 18 minutes before that thing was in weapons range. They needed to use that time well. Then he said something that surprised her. He said they would get through this together. His tone made it clear he meant it. The next hour became a blur of coordinated action. Human and Valoran ships moved into new formations, combining their different capabilities. Valoran heavy weapons provided the main firepower, while human fighters used their speed to hit weak points. Morrison's tactical creativity merged with Valoran military precision. Amy Burke worked with Thros to synchronize targeting computers between the two fleets. It should have been impossible to integrate such different technologies so quickly, but somehow they made it work. The Devourer ship opened fire first with weapons that tore through space itself. Several human ships were destroyed instantly. A Valeran cruiser took a direct hit and exploded, but the combined fleet kept fighting. They focused their fire on specific sections of the Devourer ship, trying to overwhelm its shields through concentrated damage. Kaylin watched the battle unfold with a strange mixture of fear and admiration. Morrison's instincts in combat were extraordinary. He seemed to know exactly where the Devourer would strike next. He moved his ships to intercept attacks heading toward damaged Valian vessels. When Callan's flagship took heavy fire, Morrison ordered 3 of his destroyers to move between her and the Devourer. Those human ships took damage meant for her. 2 of them were crippled, protecting the Starfire Ascendant. Callan ordered her own forces to return the favor. When Morrison's flagship lost shields, her cruisers moved to cover it, while his crew made emergency repairs. Back and forth, they protected each other like warriors who had trained together for years instead of enemies who met 4 days ago. The battle lasted 18 brutal hours. Both fleets took terrible casualties. Hundreds of crew members died on both sides. But slowly, they began to damage the Devourer ship. Its shields failed in several sections. Hull breaches appeared across its surface. Morrison called for one final coordinated strike, putting everything they had into one massive attack. Every ship that could still fire weapons targeted the same point on the Devourer's hull. Feleron plasma cannons fired alongside human missiles. The combined firepower punched through to the Devourer's power core. The alien ship exploded in a burst of dark energy that lit up half the system. When the light faded, the threat was gone. Both fleets floated in space, surrounded by debris from their own destroyed vessels and pieces of the Devourer warship. Everyone was too exhausted to celebrate. They had survived, but the cost had been terrible. Kaylin sat in her command throne and looked at the casualty reports. She had lost a third of her fleet. The humans had suffered even worse, with nearly half their ships destroyed or crippled. But they had won. They had faced something that should have killed them all, and they survived because they worked together. She opened a channel to Morrison again. His face appeared on her screen, and he looked as tired as she felt. His uniform was torn, and he had a cut on his forehead, but he was alive. Kaylin found herself relieved by that fact, which surprised her. She told him that his tactics had saved both their fleets. Without his coordination, they would all be dead. Morrison smiled slightly and said her firepower had made the difference. Without valor and weapons, they could never have damaged that ship. He thanked her for protecting his flagship when it was vulnerable. She had saved his life and the lives of his crew. There was a long pause as they looked at each other across the communication channel. Something had changed between them during the battle. They were no longer just enemies forced to cooperate. They had fought together and bled together and survived together. Kaylin realized she was seeing Morrison differently now. He was not a primitive human anymore. He was a fellow warrior who had proven himself in the most extreme circumstances. He had tactical brilliance that matched any Valeran officer she knew. He had courage that impressed her, and he had made decisions during the battle that saved Valeran lives, even when it put his own people at risk. That kind of honor was rare in any species. Finding it in a human changed everything she thought she knew about his people. Morrison spoke first and asked what happened next. Their fleets were both damaged and stranded in this system until repairs could be made. They could go back to trying to kill each other, or they could maintain the truce while both sides recovered. He said he preferred the second option, but he would respect whatever decision she made. Kaylin considered her options carefully. Her orders were to take the colony by force, but she had just fought alongside these humans and seen their worth. She had watched Morrison make choices that showed real character. She could not simply go back to treating humans as enemies after what they had shared. She told Morrison that repairs would take several days. During that time, there would be no hostilities between their forces. Her ships would not attack his, and she expected the same courtesy in return. After repairs were complete, they would discuss what came next. Morrison agreed to those terms. The communication ended, and Kaylin sat alone with her thoughts. Commander Thros approached carefully and asked what her plans were. The Emperor would want to know why she had not continued the attack on the colony. Kaylin told him the truth. She said she needed time to think. The battle had shown her things about humans that contradicted everything she had been taught. Captain Morrison was not the primitive barbarian she expected. His people fought with honor and skill. They had saved Valeran lives when they could have left her forces to die. That meant something. It had to mean something. Thros looked worried, but nodded. He understood that his princess was questioning belief she had held her entire life. That was dangerous territory for any Valan, but especially for royalty. But he was loyal, and he would support her decisions, whatever they turned out to be. After the battle with the Devourer ship, an unusual peace settled over the Epsilon 7 system. Both fleets were making repairs, and neither side wanted to restart hostilities. Human and Valoran engineering crews worked on their damaged vessels, while their commanders tried to figure out what should happen next. Princess Kaylin spent 2 days reviewing battle recordings and writing reports for her father, the Emperor. She knew he would be furious that she had not taken the colony yet. But she could not explain in a simple report what had changed during the Devourer battle. She could not put into words how fighting alongside Captain Morrison had shifted her understanding of humans. She needed time to sort through her own confused thoughts before facing her father's judgment. On the 3rd day after the battle, Callan received a message from Morrison. He requested a face-to-face meeting to discuss the future of the colony and the relationship between their forces. He suggested meeting at an abandoned asteroid station halfway between their fleets. The station was old and had been deserted for decades, but it was neutral ground where they could talk privately. Kaylin agreed to the meeting, though Commander Thros protested. He argued it could be a trap or an assassination attempt. Kaylin reminded him that Morrison could have let her die during the Devourer attack. If the human wanted her dead, he had already missed easier opportunities. She would go to this meeting, and she would hear what Morrison had to say. She ordered a full honor guard to accompany her, as was proper for Aran royalty visiting anywhere. The meeting was scheduled for midday by human time calculations. Kaylin arrived at the asteroid station with 6 of her best warriors surrounding her. They were armed and alert for any sign of treachery. But when the airlock opened and they entered the old station, they found Captain Morrison waiting alone. He wore his uniform but carried no visible weapons. He stood in the station's observation deck with his hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the stars through the massive windows. When he heard the mentor, he turned and offered a slight bow of respect. Kaylin was genuinely surprised to see him without guards or protection. She asked where his security detail was. Morrison shrugged and said he figured if she wanted him dead, a couple of guards would not make much difference. Besides, After what they went through together, he would like to think they were past assassination attempts. It was such a casual dismissal of normal protocol that Callan did not know how to respond. Part of her was offended that he treated a meeting with Valeran royalty so informally, but another part of her was intrigued by his confidence and lack of fear. She made a decision that shocked her own guards. She dismissed them and ordered them to wait outside the observation deck. They protested loudly, saying it was not safe to leave her alone with a human. Callan gave them a look that stopped all arguments. They bowed and retreated, leaving her alone with Morrison. For the first time since they met, it was just the two of them, with no crews or officers or responsibilities between them. Callan walked to the window and stood beside Morrison, looking out at space. Their two fleets were visible in the distance, human and Valoran ships floating side by side, while crews made repairs. It was a strange sight that would have been impossible a week ago. Morrison spoke first, and his voice was quiet. He said he wanted to thank her properly for what she did during the battle. Her forces had saved many human lives, and he would not forget that. Callan replied that his tactics had saved just as many Valeran lives. They had worked well together during the crisis. Morrison agreed and then said something that made Callan turn to look at him directly. He said his intelligence reports about Valerans had been wrong. He had been taught that her people were arrogant conquerors who only respected force. But fighting alongside her had shown him something different. The Valerans were proud, yes, but there was honor in that pride. She had kept her word even when it cost tactical advantage. She had protected human ships when she could have let them die. That took real character, and he respected her for it. Callan felt something shift inside her chest. No one outside her own people had ever spoken to her with such genuine respect. Humans were supposed to be the inferior species. They were supposed to fear and hate Valerans. But Morrison was treating her as an equal, as a fellow warrior worthy of consideration. She found herself saying things she had not planned to say. She told him that her understanding of humans had been wrong too. She had believed they were primitive creatures, barely capable of organized thought. But Morrison had proven himself to be a tactical genius. His people had fought with courage and coordination that matched Valoran standards, and he personally had made decisions during the battle that showed real wisdom. He could have abandoned her forces to save his own people, but he chose to protect everyone. That was the mark of a true leader. They talked for hours after that. Morrison told her about his life and his reasons for fighting. He explained that he grew up on Earth in a peaceful family. His parents were teachers, and his sister was a doctor. They lived simple, quiet lives until raiders attacked their colony world. Morrison was away on a training exercise when it happened. By the time he got back, his family was gone. Everyone he loved had been killed by pirates who saw defenseless civilians as easy targets. He joined the military not for glory or adventure, but to protect others from experiencing the same loss. He fought because someone had to stand between innocent people and those who would harm them. Every battle he fought was in memory of his family, and in hope that other families would be spared. Callan listened and felt understanding growing. She had judged Morrison and all humans based on incomplete information. She had seen them as invaders and threats without considering their motivations or their pain. Morrison was not fighting for conquest. He was fighting to protect people who depended on him. That was something she understood deeply. She told him about her own struggles as a Valorant princess. She explained that being born to royalty meant expectations that never ended. She had to be twice as good as any other officer to be taken seriously. Her father, the Emperor, loved her, but he also expected perfection. Every victory added to the family honor. Every failure brought shame. She had learned to be cold and hard, because showing weakness meant losing respect. But the truth was, she was tired of always fighting. She was tired of the weight of command and the loneliness that came with her position. Morrison listened without judgment or interruption. When she finished talking, he said something that surprised her. He told her he understood that loneliness. Being a captain meant making decisions that cost lives. It meant standing apart from your crew because you had to be ready to sacrifice them if necessary. It meant lying awake at night, wondering if you made the right choices. Command was a burden that never got lighter. No matter how many battles you won, Callan realized he was right. This human captain understood things about her that most of her own people never grasped. They saw the warrior princess in the royal title. Morrison saw the person beneath all that. He saw someone who carried heavy responsibilities and sometimes felt crushed by them. The conversation shifted to lighter topics. After that, Morrison asked about Valoran culture and customs. Callan found herself explaining things she had never discussed with outsiders before. She told him about the warrior festivals where young Valorans proved themselves in ritual combat. She described the crystal gardens of her homeworld, where flowers glowed in the darkness. She talked about music and art, and the long history of her people. Morrison listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed he was really trying to understand. In turn, Callan asked him about Earth and human culture. He told her about oceans and mountains, and the incredible diversity of life on his home world. He described human music and literature, and the way humans celebrated victories and mourned losses. He made humanity sound rich and complex and beautiful. Hours passed without either of them noticing. They had started this meeting as enemy commanders forced together by circumstances, but somewhere during the conversation, they became something else. They became two people sharing their experiences and finding common ground across the divide of their species. Callan realized she was enjoying this more than she had enjoyed anything in years. Morrison made her laugh with stories about his early military training mishaps. She surprised herself by sharing stories of her own mistakes as a young officer. They discovered they had similar senses of humor and similar views on honor and duty. The differences between human and Valan started to seem less important than the similarities. Eventually, Morrison checked the time and said he should probably return to his ship. His crew would be wondering where he disappeared to. Callan agreed reluctantly. She did not want the conversation to end, but she knew it had to. They walked back to the airlock together in comfortable silence. Before Morrison left, he turned to her and said he hoped they could talk again soon. He said these few hours had taught him more about Valorans than years of intelligence reports. Callan surprised herself by agreeing. She said she would send a message when she had time for another meeting. Morrison smiled, and it was a warm, genuine expression. He thanked her for taking the time to see him as a person, instead of just an enemy. The peace between the human and Valoran fleets lasted 6 days before a new crisis emerged. Long-range sensors detected distress signals from a Valoran supply convoy traveling through a nearby system. The convoy was carrying civilian refugees from a distant colony that had been hit by an asteroid strike. Families with children were trying to reach safety when pirates attacked them. The distress call reached Princess Kaelin's fleet first, but her ships were still damaged from the Devourer battle. She had enough vessels to respond, but barely. Her tactical officers estimated that reaching the convoy before the pirates finished their attack would require pushing damaged engines beyond safe limits. Several of her ships might suffer complete drive failures attempting the rescue. Commander Thros suggested waiting for reinforcements, but that would take too long. The civilians would be dead or captured by then. Kaelin stood on her bridge trying to decide between duty and caution when an unexpected transmission came through. It was Captain Jake Morrison. He said his sensors had also picked up the distress call. His ships were in better condition than hers because they had taken less damage fighting the Devourer. He offered to send his fastest vessels to help rescue the Valeran civilians. Kaelin felt shock ripple through her bridge crew. A human was offering to help save Valoran lives. Every instinct she had been trained with said this had to be a trick or a trap, but she looked at Morrison's face on the screen and saw only genuine concern. He said no one deserved to be attacked while fleeing disaster. His people would help if she allowed it. Kaelin made a decision that would have been unthinkable 2 weeks ago. She accepted his offer and told him she would send her fastest cruiser as escort. Together, their forces would reach the convoy in time. Morrison's task force reached the convoy 4 hours later. Lieutenant Amy Burke commanded the human ships, and she coordinated with the Valoran escort perfectly. They drove off the pirates with minimal casualties and began emergency repairs on the damaged convoy vessels. But something happened during the rescue that would change everything. One of the refugee ships had suffered a hull breach and was losing atmosphere. Valeran crew members were trying to evacuate civilians through emergency airlocks. A young human soldier named Chris Hayes was helping seal bulkheads when he noticed a group of Valeran children trapped in a section that was about to depressurize. Chris could have evacuated himself. He had time to reach safety. Instead, he stayed behind and manually operated the emergency airlock to get the children out. He saved 7 young Valerans before the bulkhead failed. Chris died in the vacuum, doing his duty to protect lives that were not even his own species. The news of Chris Hayes' sacrifice reached Princess Kaelin while the ET convoy was still traveling back to Epsilon 7. She read the report 3 times trying to understand why a human would make such a choice. Commander Thros explained that Hayes was only 22 years old. He had joined the military less than 2 years ago. He had no special training or rank. He was just an ordinary soldier who saw people in danger and acted without thinking about species or politics. One of the Valoran mothers who survived spoke to Lieutenant Burke. She said Chris had smiled at her children and told them not to be scared. He had promised to get them home to their mother. He kept that promise, even though it cost him everything. Burke included the mother's words in her report. She added that Chris Hayes represented the best of humanity, and she hoped his sacrifice would be remembered. When the convoy arrived at Epsilon 7, Princess Callan went personally to greet the refugees. It was not common for Valeran royalty to meet with civilians, but Callan felt she needed to see these people herself. She needed to understand what a human had died for. The refugees were mostly families with young children. They had lost their homes in the asteroid strike and were traveling to start new lives on another colony world. They were scared and tired and grateful to be alive. An elderly Valeran woman approached Callan and bowed deeply. She said the princess needed to know that humans had saved them. The woman described how Lieutenant Burke's crews had treated Valeran wounded with the same care they showed their own people. She talked about how they shared food and medical supplies without hesitation, and she told the story of Chris Hayes, who gave his life for children he did not know. Callan listened and felt something fundamental break inside her worldview. She had been raised to believe humans were lesser beings, who only cared about themselves. But Chris Hayes had proven that was a lie. He had shown a level of selflessness and honor that most Valian warriors aspired to, but rarely achieved. He had sacrificed everything for beings from a species that his government considered enemies. That kind of moral courage transcended all the propaganda and prejudice Callan had been taught. She thanked the refugees and returned to her ship with her mind full of troubled thoughts. She found Captain Morrison later that evening on a communication channel. They had continued their private conversations over the past few days, and it had become natural to talk to him when she needed to process difficult situations. Morrison was in his ready room looking tired. He had been informed about Chris Hayes' death, and it clearly weighed on him. Callan asked him a question that had been bothering her since she heard the news. She asked why Hayes would sacrifice himself for people whose empire saw humans as inferior. Morrison was quiet for a long moment before answering. He said that Chris acted because it was the right thing to do, regardless of politics or species. Humans did not help others because they expected something in return. They helped because seeing someone in danger triggered an instinctive need to protect and save. It was part of human nature going back thousands of years. Humans survived as a species because they took care of each other, even when it was dangerous or costly. Chris Hayes did not think about Valoran versus human. He just saw children who needed help, and he gave that help. That was what humanity was at its core. Callan felt tears form in her eyes, which shocked her. Valoran warriors did not cry. Showing such emotion was considered weakness. But she could not help her reaction to Morrison's words. She told him that her people had been wrong about humans. She had been wrong about humans. They were not primitive or barbaric. They had a depth of compassion and courage that deserved respect. Chris Hayes had died protecting Valorant children, and that sacrifice meant more than all the military victories in history. She asked Morrison what she should do with this new understanding. How could she go back to fighting humans after seeing their true nature? Morrison said he had been asking himself the same question. He said, maybe they were not meant to be enemies. Maybe this whole conflict was built on misunderstanding and fear of the unknown. Maybe there was a better path forward if both sides were brave enough to take it. They talked deep into the night about possibilities and dreams. Morrison spoke about his vision of humans and Valerans working together to explore the galaxy. He imagined joint colonies and shared technology. He talked about the strength that would come from combining human adaptability with Valer and precision, two species that complemented each other instead of fighting. Callan found herself caught up in his vision. She added her own ideas about cultural exchange and mutual defense treaties. She described how Valoran philosophy and human creativity could create something new and wonderful. For a few hours, they let themselves imagine a future without war or hatred. It was a beautiful dream, but both of them knew the reality was far more complicated. Their governments would not accept peace easily. There were forces on both sides that wanted continued conflict. When their conversation finally ended, Callan sat alone and thought about Chris Hayes. She had never met the young soldier, but his actions had changed her fundamentally. She could not hate humans anymore. She could not see them as enemies deserving destruction. Chris had shown her a truth that could not be denied. Humanity had worth and dignity and honor. They deserved to be treated as equals, not conquered, as inferiors. But accepting that truth meant defying her father and possibly her entire civilization. It meant standing against everything she had been raised to believe. Kaylin had always been an obedient daughter and loyal princess. She had followed orders without question her entire life. But now she was being asked to order attacks on people who had proven themselves worthy of respect. She did not know if she could do that anymore. The next morning, Kaylin received a message from her father, Emperor Theron. He had learned about the rescue of the refugee convoy, and he was not pleased. He demanded to know why she had allowed humans to help save Valoran civilians. He said it made the Empire look weak to accept assistance from primitives. He ordered her to resume attacks on the human colony immediately. Any further delays would be seen as disobedience and would result in consequences. Callan read the message and felt anger rise in her chest. Her father was more concerned with appearance than with the fact that humans had saved Valeran lives. He cared more about pride than about the truth of what she had witnessed. For the first time in her life, Kaylin considered disobeying a direct order from her emperor. The thought terrified her, but it also felt necessary. She contacted Morrison and told him about her father's message. She said she did not want to attack the colony. Princess Kaylin's return to the Valeran homeworld came sooner than she wanted. Her father, Emperor Theron, had grown impatient with her delays and demanded she appear before him in person to explain her failures. The journey back took 5 days, and Kaylin spent every moment of that time preparing for the confrontation she knew was coming. Commander Thros tried to help her compose diplomatic explanations, but Kaylin knew her father would not accept excuses. She had failed to take the human colony. She had cooperated with the enemy. She had allowed humans to save Valoran civilians. In her father's eyes, these were not signs of wisdom, but symptoms of weakness. She arrived at the royal palace, knowing this meeting could end her military career, and possibly worse. The throne room of the Valoran Empire was designed to intimidate visitors. It was vast and filled with monuments to past victories. The walls showed holographic displays of conquered worlds and defeated enemies. Emperor Theron sat on a throne carved from a single massive crystal that had taken craftsmen 50 years to shape. He was an impressive figure even at his age. His purple skin showed the scars of battles fought in his youth. His silver eyes held the cold calculation of a ruler who had maintained power for 6 decades. When Callan entered the room, he did not greet her warmly. He looked at her with disappointment that hurt more than anger would have. He waited until she knelt before speaking. Then he asked her to explain why she had defied his orders and failed in her mission. Callan rose and stood straight before her father. She had decided during the journey that she would tell the complete truth, no matter what it cost her. She described the battle with Captain Morrison and how his tactical skills had surprised her. She explained the appearance of the Devourer ship and how human and Valoran forces had worked together to survive. She told him about the conversations with Morrison and what she had learned about human culture and capabilities. She spoke about Chris Hayes, who had died saving Valeran children. She laid out every detail of her experiences and conclusions. She finished by saying that humans were not the primitive enemies they had been portrayed as. They were potential allies who deserved respect. Attacking them was not just morally wrong, but strategically foolish. The galaxy had threats far greater than humanity. Working together made more sense than bleeding each other over contested colonies. Emperor Theron listened without interrupting, but his expression grew colder with each word. When Kaylin finished her explanation, he sat in silence for a long moment. Then he spoke, and his voice was filled with contempt. He said Kaylin had allowed herself to be manipulated by a clever human commander. Captain Morrison had obviously played on her emotions and clouded her judgment. The story about the soldier sacrificing himself was likely propaganda designed to make humans look noble. Real warriors did not concern themselves with such sentiments. The Valoran Empire had ruled through strength for thousands of years. They did not negotiate with species who had barely learned to travel between stars. Humans were competitors for resources and territory. They needed to be conquered before they became strong enough to threaten Valoran supremacy. Kaylin felt anger rise in her chest, but she kept her voice calm. She told her father that dismissing her experiences as manipulation was insulting to her intelligence. She had fought in many wars and knew when someone was trying to deceive her. Captain Morrison and his people had proven themselves through actions, not words. The battle recordings showed human tactical brilliance. The rescue of the refugee convoy demonstrated human compassion. These were facts, not propaganda. Her father was choosing to ignore reality because it contradicted his prejudices. Emperor Theron's face darkened at being challenged so directly. No one spoke to him that way, especially not his own daughter. He rose from his throne and walked down the steps until he stood directly before Kaelin. He said she had become weak and sentimental. She had forgotten what it meant to be Valeran. She had disgraced herself and her family. The Emperor gave Kaelin an ultimatum. She would return to Epsilon 7 with a massive battle fleet. She would destroy the human colony and drive their forces from the system completely. If she succeeded, he would forgive her previous failures. If she refused or failed again, she would be stripped of her rank and title. She would be exiled from Valeran space and declared dead to her family. No Valeran would be allowed to acknowledge her existence. It was the harshest punishment short of execution. The Emperor gave her 3 weeks to prepare. At the end of that time, she would either prove her loyalty or cease to be his daughter. Then he turned his back on her and returned to his throne. The audience was over. Kaelin was dismissed like a failed servant, rather than a princess of the royal blood. Kaelin left the throne room feeling numb. Commander Thros was waiting outside and he looked worried. He had heard rumors about what the Emperor planned to do. Kaelin told him everything. She said she had 3 weeks before she had to make an impossible choice. Attack people she now respected, or lose everything she had ever known. Thros asked what she was going to do. Kaelin said she did not know yet. She needed time to think, and to talk to someone who would understand. That night, she sent an encrypted message to Captain Jake Morrison, using the private communication channels they had established. She explained her situation and asked for his advice. She knew it was dangerous to share such information with someone who was technically still an enemy, but Morrison was the only person she trusted to give her honest guidance. Meanwhile, on Earth, Captain Jake Morrison faced his own crisis. His cooperation with Princess Kaelin had not gone unnoticed by human military command. Admiral Helen Martinez arrived at Epsilon 7 to personally investigate Morrison's conduct. She was a veteran officer who had fought against in several border skirmishes. She did not trust aliens, and she especially did not trust that Morrison's judgment was sound. In his ready room, she confronted him directly. She said reports indicated he had developed personal feelings for the enemy commander. His decisions were being influenced by emotion rather than tactical reality. The psychological evaluation suggested he was suffering from a form of identification with his captor. Even though he had never technically been captured, it was affecting his ability to command effectively. Morrison defended himself by pointing to results. His cooperation with Kaelin had saved the colony and both fleets when the Devourer attacked. Working with the Valerans had rescued civilians that would have died otherwise. His approach had created possibilities for peace that had never existed before. But Admiral Martinez was not convinced. She said Morrison was thinking like an idealist instead of a soldier. The Valerans were enemies, and would always be enemies. Any cooperation was temporary at best. Princess Kaelin would eventually follow her orders and attack. When that happened, Morrison's feelings would make him hesitate at a critical moment. That hesitation would cost human lives. Therefore, she had no choice but to relieve him of command. Morrison was officially stripped of his captaincy, effective immediately. He would return to Earth for psychological evaluation and court-martial proceedings. Commander Lisa Grant would take over the defense of Epsilon 7. Jake Morrison sat in what had been his ready room and tried to process what had happened. His military career was over. Everything he had worked for was gone. But the thing that bothered him most was knowing Kaelin was facing similar consequences for the same reasons. Both of them had chosen to see beyond prejudice, and now both were being punished for it. He received her encrypted message that evening and read it 3 times. She was asking for advice, but he knew she had already made her decision. She would not attack the colony. She would choose principle over power, just like she had told him she wanted to. But that choice would cost her everything she had ever known. It would leave her alone and exiled with nowhere to go. Morrison made a decision in that moment. He would not let Kaelin face that fate by herself. He composed a reply carefully, knowing it might be intercepted despite the encryption. He told Callan that duty to conscience mattered more than duty to authority. Her father wanted her to conquer, because conquest was familiar and easy. But she had seen a better way was possible. She had witnessed the potential for cooperation between their species. Following her moral compass might cost her title and home, but it would let her look at herself in the mirror. Sometimes principles required sacrifice. He said he understood that better than ever before. He was facing his own consequences for choosing what he believed was right. But he would make the same choices again, because living with compromised principles was worse than losing rank or position. He finished the message by saying, whatever she decided, he would support her. She was not alone in this, even if it felt that way. 3 weeks passed too quickly. Callan spent that time on her homeworld, watching the massive battle fleet assemble. Her father had committed over 100 warships to the attack on Epsilon 7. It was enough firepower to destroy 10 colonies, let alone one. There would be no possibility of human resistance. The humans would be obliterated unless they evacuated completely. Commander Thross tried to convince Callan to follow orders. He said she could attack and then work for peace through diplomatic channels later. She did not have to lose everything. The silence after Princess Callan's announcement lasted for exactly 30 seconds. Then Commander Thross stepped forward on the bridge of the Starfire Ascendant and declared his support for his commander. He said he had fought beside humans during the Devourer battle, and he agreed they deserved respect. If Callan was choosing exile for her principles, then he would follow her into that exile. His declaration broke the dam. Other officers on the bridge added their voices. Then communications started coming in from other ships in the fleet. Captains and crews who had witnessed human courage firsthand spoke up. They said they believed in Callan's vision of peace. They would follow her even if it meant losing everything. Within an hour, more than 40 ships had broken formation to join Callan. It was not the majority of the fleet, but it was enough to show that she was not alone. Her stand had resonated with warriors who were tired of meaningless conflicts. Emperor Theron watched from his palace as his fleet split apart. His face showed rage mixed with something that might have been grudging respect. His daughter had always been strong-willed, but he never imagined she would defy him so completely. She had turned a moment of disobedience into a movement. He could not attack her now without triggering civil war. Too many ships and crews supported her position. He would have to accept this humiliation and deal with it through politics rather than force. He sent a final message to Callan. It was brief and cold. He said she was no longer his daughter. She was exiled from Velaran space forever. Any Velaran who acknowledged her existence would face severe punishment. Then he cut all communications. Callan watched her father's message and felt grief but also relief. She had made her choice, and she would live with the consequences. But at least those consequences came from following her conscience. The rebel fleet made the jump to Epsilon 7, knowing they were now homeless. They had abandoned their positions and families to follow an exiled princess, based on hope for a better future. When they arrived in the system, the human forces detected them immediately. Commander Lisa Grant ordered general quarters expecting an attack, but Callan broadcast on all frequencies explaining what had happened. She said she was no longer princess of the Valoran Empire. She was just Callan now, a warrior who believed in peace between their species. She had brought ships and crews willing to fight for that peace. She requested permission to meet with Captain Jake Morrison, if he was available. Grant was surprised, but forwarded the message to Earth Command for guidance. The response came back quickly, and it shocked everyone. Captain Morrison was no longer in command. He had been relieved and was being held pending court-martial. But Morrison himself had sent a message. He had somehow gotten access to communication systems, despite being under guard. He said he was coming to Epsilon 7, whether he had permission or not. Jake Morrison arrived at Epsilon 7 3 days later on a civilian transport. He had escaped from custody on Earth, with help from sympathetic officers who believed in what he was trying to accomplish. He was now technically a fugitive from military justice, but he did not care anymore. His career was already destroyed. He might as well finish what he started. When his transport docked at the colony station, Callan was waiting for him. They saw each other in person for the first time since the Devourer battle. She looked different without her royal uniform and symbols of rank. He looked tired but determined. They stood facing each other for a moment, and then Callan did something that shocked her own crew. She embraced Morrison in a gesture of affection that transcended species barriers. He returned the embrace, and for that moment, they were not enemy commanders or political symbols. They were two people who had found connection across impossible divides. The next weeks were chaotic as human and Valoran forces tried to figure out what their new relationship should be. Kalen's fleet needed supplies and repairs. The humans needed allies who understood Valoran technology and tactics. Slowly, they began working together, not because they were ordered to, but because they chose to. Joint patrols started protecting the colony from pirates. Mixed crews began serving on ships, learning from each other. Human engineers helped repair Valoran vessels, while Valoran scientists shared advanced technology. It was messy and difficult and full of misunderstandings, but it was also proof that cooperation was possible on both the Valaran homeworld and Earth. There were those who saw this development as betrayal, but there were also those who saw it as hope for something better. 6 months after Kalen's exile, formal peace talks began. Representatives from the Valoran Empire and the United Human Coalition met at the same abandoned asteroid station where Jake and Kalen had first opened their hearts to each other. The negotiations were difficult, with hardliners on both sides, resisting compromise. But Kalen and Morrison served as mediators, representing neither government officially, but respected by both. They used their understanding of both cultures to bridge gaps and find common ground. Slowly, painfully, an agreement took shape. The Epsilon 7 Accords established the first formal alliance between Valerans and humans. It created joint defense agreements and trade relationships. It set up cultural exchange programs and shared research initiatives. It was not perfect, but it was a beginning. The treaty signing ceremony was attended by dignitaries from dozens of worlds. Emperor Theron sent a representative, though he himself refused to come. The human president attended, but kept his distance from Morrison, who was still technically wanted for desertion. But when the documents were signed and the agreements made official, everyone present knew they were witnessing history. Two species that had been on the edge of war had chosen peace instead, and at the heart of that peace were two warriors who had dared to see past hatred and prejudice. After the ceremony ended and the crowds left, Kalen and Jake found themselves alone at the observation window where they had first really talked. They stood side by side, looking out at human and Valorant ships patrolling together, and at the colony below, where two species were learning to live side by side. Jake spoke first, and said it felt strange to have everything finally settled. For months, they had been fighting just to survive, and to make people listen. Now, the future they had dreamed about was actually starting to happen. Kalen agreed, but said the hard work was just beginning. They had created the framework for peace, but building actual trust would take years. There would be setbacks and difficulties. There were still those on both sides who wanted this alliance to fail. Her father barely acknowledged her existence. Human military command still had officers who thought she had manipulated Jake, but she was ready for those challenges. She had chosen this path, knowing it would not be easy. Jake smiled and said he had made the same choice. His military career was over. He would probably spend time in prison for desertion and disobeying orders, but he had no regrets. What they had accomplished was worth any personal cost. Callan turned to look at him directly. She said there was something she needed to tell him, and she had been putting it off too long. When she first met him, she had hated humans with every part of her being. She thought his species was primitive and barbaric and unworthy of respect. But he had proven her completely wrong. He had shown her courage and honor and a kind of moral strength she had rarely seen. He had earned her respect on the battlefield, and somewhere along the way, he had earned something more. She was not sure how humans expressed such things, but in Valoran culture, when a warrior found someone who understood them completely, it was considered a bond of the heart. She had found that bond with Jake Morrison. He had become the most important person in her life. She needed him to know that before anything else happened. Jake was quiet for a long moment, processing what she had said. Then he smiled in a way that lit up his entire face. He said humans had a tradition of being direct about feelings, so he would follow that tradition. Now, when he first saw Kaylin on his view screen, he thought she was the enemy, and probably someone he would have to kill. But fighting beside her had changed everything. She had shown him that strength came from more than just weapons and tactics. She had demonstrated a kind of wisdom that came from questioning everything she thought she knew. She had chosen truth over tradition, even when it cost her everything. That took a level of courage he could only admire. And yes, at some point his respect had turned into something deeper. He cared about her in ways that went beyond friendship or alliance. She had earned his heart just as she said he had earned hers. They kissed then, and it was a moment that symbolized everything they had fought for. Two people from different worlds who had been raised to hate each other, choosing love instead. Outside the window, stars shone on a galaxy that was full of possibilities. There would be challenges ahead. Not everyone would accept this new alliance. There would be those who saw it as weakness or betrayal, but there would also be those who saw it as hope. The Valoran Empire and humanity had taken the first steps toward a shared future. Other species watching from distant stars would have to decide how they felt about that. Some would see opportunity for trade and cooperation. Others would see threat and prepare for conflict. The galaxy was changing, and no one knew exactly what would come next.